Most people at the neighborhood pool thought she was just another tired single mom. Sunhat, camouflage duffel bag, and a toddler balanced on one hip. But when a loud-mouthed woman named Karen tried to have her thrown out for violating community rules, no one expected the mother's quiet call would summon 20 Navy SEALs to the pool deck. What started as a petty tantrum turned into a moment this upscale suburb would never forget. And it all began on a sunny Saturday afternoon. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. It was the kind of summer day that begged for iced lemonade and wet footprints on hot concrete. Suburban kids shrieked and splashed as their parents lounged under sun umbrellas, sunglasses hiding the yawns of another lazy weekend. At the center of this controlled chaos was the Riverview Heights Community Pool, exclusive to residents, pristine, and more than a little proud of its HOA rulebook. Among the crowd, no one paid much attention to the woman in the Army PT shirt as she sat up near the edge of the shallow end. She was early 30s, athletic, and clearly accustomed to multitasking with a kid on her hip and one eye scanning for danger even in this peaceful neighborhood. Her name was Harper Lane, and today was her son's 4th birthday. Harper had no intention of making a scene. She had planned a quiet, low-key birthday celebration. No rented characters, no balloons choking the fences, no DJ spinning sugary pop. Just a few cupcakes, a picnic blanket, and maybe some friends stopping by. What most of the pool-goers didn't know was that Harper had just returned from an 11-month deployment overseas. A combat medic with multiple tours under her belt, she'd spent the last year patching up soldiers in a sandbox half a world away. Her husband, Aaron, a Navy SEAL, was still deployed. Somewhere classified. Somewhere dangerous. He wouldn't make it to the birthday, and their son, Milo, had finally stopped asking when Dad would be home. All Harper wanted was a simple day for her son. No drama, no headlines, just smiles and a few safe memories. But fate, as it often does, had other plans. Karen Hollingsworth arrived 15 minutes after Harper. Tall, platinum blonde, and dressed in the uniform of HOA superiority, oversized sun hat, designer swimsuit, and a clipboard she used more often than her SPF. She was a woman who saw herself as the guardian of community standards. Her own children, teenagers who barely acknowledged her, were off near the deep end. Karen didn't like surprises, and she especially didn't like seeing unfamiliar faces without prior approval. To her, Harper didn't fit the mold of Riverview Heights. No husband in sight, camouflage gear sprawled by the lounge chairs, and no RSVP in the online pool calendar, a clear violation of at least 3 unwritten social rules. Harper noticed Karen's arrival the way any trained soldier notices a potential threat, calm, calculated, and without any outward display of concern. Karen didn't speak to her immediately, choosing instead to huff and pace along the pool's edge, asking passive-aggressive questions of the lifeguards, then glancing back with tight-lipped disapproval. Harper was used to scrutiny. She'd had generals bark orders in her face and insurgents point rifles at her chest. A Suburban control freak armed with a clipboard didn't raise her blood pressure, but it was clear that this wasn't going to be a peaceful afternoon. As Milo dipped his toes into the shallow end, Harper laid out a modest spread, a thermos of lemonade, store-bought cupcakes, paper plates, and a worn teddy bear that had seen more battles than most soldiers. A few neighborhood kids wandered over, drawn by the treats and Milo's infectious grin. Harper smiled, thanked them for coming, and poured lemonade into tiny plastic cups. It was a scene so gentle, so humble, that it only seemed to enrage Karen more. Finally, Karen marched over. Her heels clicked against the pool deck like a judge entering court. She leaned in close as if proximity gave her authority and began to question Harper about her residency status, guest list, and whether or not she had obtained proper clearance for a party. Harper remained calm, politely explaining she lived in the neighborhood with her son, that she wasn't disturbing anyone, and that she hadn't invited a crowd, just a couple of friends. But Karen was on a mission, and Harper's civility only seemed to stoke the fire. As Karen's voice rose, pool-goers began to glance over. Harper's face remained serene, but behind her sunglasses, her eyes scanned for the nearest exit, the lifeguard's posture, the edge of every shadow. It was instinct. Not fear, just conditioning. She never raised her voice, never insulted Karen, never matched venom with venom. Instead, she pulled out her phone, tapped a single contact, and sent a brief message. 4 words. Nothing dramatic, just parties at the pool. What Karen didn't know, what no one knew, was that Harper had built a kind of family over the years that went far beyond blood. 20 Navy SEALs, all brothers to her husband and uncles to her son, had quietly flown in over the last 24 hours. Aaron, still deployed, had asked them to stand in for him, not for show, not for spectacle, but because he knew how much Harper had carried alone. The plan had always been to surprise Milo with them, to give him the next best thing to having his dad back. Harper hadn't told anyone, not even the HOA, because she didn't want a scene. But now, with Karen calling the HOA president and threatening to have Harper removed from the premises, the story had taken a turn, and the text had been sent. 20 SEALs were on their way. What began as a peaceful birthday picnic for a young boy and his mother was about to become a wake-up call for an entire community. Karen thought she was enforcing rules. What she didn't realize was that she had just triggered the arrival of a force far greater than she could comprehend, not in size, but in spirit. The kind of force that didn't need noise to make a point, the kind that answered a mother's quiet call and changed everything. The pool deck simmered with the sticky heat of midday sun, but the real tension came from the slow, awkward silence that fell after Karen's latest outburst. A few sunbathers pulled off their sunglasses to stare, while lifeguards exchanged unsure glances. The younger kids, sensing something just under the surface, grew quieter as the sense of unease filtered through the air, like chlorine. Harper sat back on the edge of her towel, legs folded, posture relaxed. But beneath her calm exterior, she was already tracking next steps. Not out of fear, but from habit. She had been in situations where a single misread tone could spiral into something dangerous. This, thankfully, wasn't one of those times. At worst, it was an overinflated ego looking for someone to crush. Karen, however, mistook Harper's silence for weakness. Her voice got louder, more performative, as if she needed the crowd to validate her authority. She paced in small, sharp turns, the way someone used to having the last word did when their complaints weren't immediately obeyed. With a raised arm, she called over the pool manager, a 20-something kid named Brad, who looked like he still lived off frozen burritos and protein shakes. Brad, flustered and uncertain, glanced between the two women like he'd been handed a live grenade. Karen wasted no time painting her version of events. Unauthorized parties, strangers at the pool, vague threats to community safety. It was the kind of performance that had worked for her before. She was loud, forceful, and she made sure to sprinkle in a few mentions of her lawyer, just for good measure. Harper didn't interrupt. She didn't argue. She simply sat there with Milo nestled beside her, the boy quietly licking icing off a cupcake, oblivious to the gathering storm. The other parents started whispering, a few clearly sympathetic, but no one brave enough to step in just yet. It was easier to let the drama unfold than to become part of it. That's how it usually went, until something forced people to choose a side. Karen turned to Harper again, this time pointing a freshly manicured finger in her face. She demanded she pack up, remove herself and her uninvited guests, of which there were none, and vacate the pool immediately. She claimed she was escalating it to the board, which in Riverview Heights was supposed to be the final word. Brad, the manager, scratched his head and mumbled something about needing to check the guest list policy, but it was clear he didn't want to be in charge. Still, he glanced at Harper with a look that asked, "Will you just leave and save us the hassle?" That was when the first SUV arrived. Preparing and narrating the story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. It didn't screech up or blast music. It didn't roar in with lights flashing. It simply rolled into the parking lot with the smooth confidence of people who never had to prove anything to anyone. Matte black, windows tinted, no decals, no markings, just a quiet presence. Then a second one arrived. Then a third. Within minutes, 4 SUVs lined the parking edge, and doors began to open. Men stepped out. Not loud, not aggressive, just certain. The way people moved when they had walked into foreign cities with nothing but each other and still came out alive. Muscular but not bulky, clean-cut but not corporate. Their clothes were casual, some in board shorts, others in neutral t-shirts, but their posture screamed discipline. One of them, tall and tan, with a sleeve tattoo curling around his arm, spotted Harper immediately and gave her a nod. She returned it with a small smile. He reached into the back seat and lifted out a wrapped gift almost comically oversized for a 4-year-old. Behind him, another man pulled out a beach bag filled with Nerf guns and pool floaties. None of them made any attempt to confront Karen. They weren't there for her. But Karen was already fuming. Her face turned beet red as she realized that these arrivals were connected to the very woman she had been trying to evict. She spun toward Brad, demanding to know how these non-residents had entered the premises and insisting they be stopped before they reached the pool deck. Brad hesitated. These men didn't look like troublemakers, but they didn't exactly look like the country club crowd either. He glanced at Harper again, this time with uncertainty. Harper stood slowly, brushing cupcake crumbs from her lap, and Milo clung to her hand, beaming with the kind of happiness only a child who didn't know the weight of the world could hold. The first seal knelt and opened his arms, catching the boy in a hug that lifted him clean off the ground. The others began filtering in, laughing softly, clapping Harper on the back, tossing playful insults at one another the way brothers did. They brought with them an energy that was unmistakably joyful, yet somehow still carried the unmistakable gravity of men who had seen too much and endured more. Karen stood paralyzed, caught somewhere between disbelief and indignation. She wasn't used to being ignored, and that's exactly what was happening. These men didn't even glance at her. It wasn't intentional rudeness. It was simply that she wasn't relevant. They weren't there to argue. They were there for Harper, for Milo, and for the promise they had made to a brother overseas. The party transformed. In moments, the cupcakes were joined by a cooler full of snacks. A Bluetooth speaker hummed low music. A few of the seals played with the kids, organizing impromptu water gun battles, while others began setting up a small inflatable slide one of them had stuffed in the back of a truck. More parents began inching closer, drawn by the warmth and fun that had clearly taken over, and slowly opinions began to shift. Brad faded into the background, grateful he wouldn't have to make a decision after all. Karen, though, stood rooted to her spot, watching the story slip out of her control. It was no longer about rules or community standards. Something else was happening, something she couldn't quite understand. And Harper, still quiet, still dignified, let it unfold. She didn't gloat. She didn't offer any words of retribution. She didn't need to, because what was rising in that moment was bigger than a birthday. It was the beginning of a reckoning, and Karen had no idea just how far it would go. The arrival of the Navy SEALs altered the atmosphere of the pool like a sudden shift in the weather. One moment it had been a tense powder keg of neighborly rules and forced politeness, and the next it was alive with uncontainable energy. The transformation was subtle yet undeniable. The children, sensing a new kind of safety and excitement, became bolder and freer in their play. Parents, once cautious and detached, started inching closer to the growing group clustered near Harper's towel. The sound of Milo's laughter rang out, high and clear, as one of the SEALs hoisted him onto his shoulders and pretended to stumble under his weight. It was the kind of scene that couldn't be staged. It had warmth, it had camaraderie, and it had that rarest of things in tightly wound communities like Riverview Heights, genuine connection. Harper remained composed in the center of it all. She wasn't orchestrating anything, yet the entire flow of activity seemed to orbit around her. She exchanged easy conversation with the men who clearly respected her deeply. They called her Doc, a nickname that told more about her history than any formal introduction. It wasn't the kind of name you picked up casually. It was a battlefield title, earned under fire, spoken only by those who had seen her work with steady hands and unshakable calm while chaos screamed all around. The pool deck had never held such quiet intensity, masked now by the innocent buzz of a birthday party. But Karen was not blind. She may not have understood the military dynamic at play, but she sensed power shifting, and power shifts had always unsettled her. Her authority, once absolute in matters of neighborhood order, now hung in the air like a useless life vest. She stood near the shaded lounge chairs, pretending to scroll through her phone, casting glances that ranged from irritated to confused. She wasn't used to being ignored, especially not by people she deemed beneath her. And worse, she recognized a pattern forming. People who'd previously nodded at her out of obligation were now turning toward Harper. Mothers began speaking with her, cautiously at first, and then more openly. One woman asked if her son could join the water gun battle, and a SEAL gently handed the boy a toy and gave him a wink. The barrier was cracking. Karen couldn't take it anymore. With a visible huff, she stormed over to the pool manager's chair again, her steps sharp with manufactured urgency. She pulled Brad aside and began whispering, though her voice was strained and far from settle. "The pool wasn't zoned for private parties," she said. "There was a guest limit," she insisted. "These were violations, she was sure of it. And what if these men weren't even supposed to be here? They're strangers. What did she even know about them? This wasn't safe." Brad nodded along, his expression a picture of dread. He knew Karen's reputation. Her complaints always ended up on board agendas, and board agendas turned into policy changes. He didn't want to confront Harper or the quiet warriors who surrounded her, but Karen was relentless. If she couldn't command attention through presence, she would do it through procedure. Brad approached Harper with all the confidence of a man about to step on a rake. He cleared his throat and apologized, trying to smile, but his discomfort was obvious. He mumbled about some residents raising concerns. He didn't say Karen's name, but he didn't have to. Harper tilted her head slightly and listened, offering no resistance. Her calm unsettled him more than anger might have. When he finished, she asked one simple question. Had she broken any specific rule? Brad hesitated. He wasn't sure. He hadn't reviewed the bylaws. He didn't know if there was a clause for birthday parties that didn't include bounce houses and blaring music. All he knew was that someone important was complaining. At that moment, another SUV pulled into the parking lot. This one was different, smaller, older, and driven with purpose. Out stepped a woman in her late 50s, dressed in jeans and a collared blouse, clipboard in hand. That clipboard, the true symbol of Riverview Heights. The HOA president had arrived. Her name was Lorraine Banner, and her presence caused even Karen to straighten her posture. Lorraine wasn't a tyrant, she was old school, and her opinions carried weight. Karen nearly jogged to her, delivering her version of events in a low, hurried voice. Harper watched from the towel without moving, her face unreadable. Lorraine took in the scene slowly. She looked at the cupcakes, the children laughing, the respectful, unobtrusive men standing to the side, some tossing footballs with the kids, others chatting with parents. She noticed how no alcohol was in sight. No music was louder than background ambiance. No one was being disruptive. It didn't add up to the picture Karen had painted. Finally, Lorraine approached Harper. There was a long pause as the two women regarded each other. Lorraine had seen her share of mothers over the years, some frazzled, some entitled, some disengaged. But this one had poise, discipline, grace. Lorraine introduced herself, and Harper responded with a handshake. Firm, respectful, confident. Lorraine glanced at Milo and asked if it was his birthday. Harper nodded. She offered no excuses, no apologies, just facts. She explained that the guests were family, in the way that the military often defines it. Brothers and uncles, not by blood, but by bond. She told Lorraine they would leave if they were truly unwelcome. The men wouldn't raise a fuss. They had come only to give a little boy a moment of joy in his father's absence. Lorraine looked around again, more slowly this time, and what she saw was not a violation. It was a community, One momentarily expanded in the best possible way. A group of men who knew how to be present without being disruptive, a mother who carried herself with quiet command, a birthday party that, by all accounts, had actually made the pool more vibrant. She turned back to Karen and simply said, "I see no problem here." Karen's face twisted in disbelief, but Lorraine didn't flinch. Her decision was final. And just like that, the tide shifted. Karen didn't leave, but she faded, her power drained by something she couldn't name. Harper returned to the picnic blanket and resumed passing out cupcakes. The seals resumed playing with Milo and his new friends, and the neighborhood, though it didn't know it yet, had already begun to change. Because when a military mom quietly endures what others can't, when she carries more weight than anyone sees, and when a brotherhood arrives without fanfare to lift her up, people notice, and some never see things the same way again. Lorraine's words might as well have been a gavel dropped on a courtroom bench. "I see no problem here," echoed with a kind of finality that stopped Karen's protest mid-breath and cast an invisible circle of calm around Harper and the birthday gathering. For years, Karen had operated on the belief that authority belonged to the loudest voice in the room, the one with the most complaints or the highest number of committee meetings attended. But Harper had said little, done less, and yet her presence, reinforced by the arrival of those quiet, formidable men, had unseated Karen's influence in a matter of minutes. She stood now by the lounge chairs, arms crossed, lips thin with silent fury, as Lorraine walked off, clipboard tapping against her hip like a sheriff's badge. The party resumed its natural rhythm, flowing now with even greater ease. A couple of the seals had inflated the small slide and were using it to launch kids into the shallow end with hilarious splashes that sent them into fits of giggles. One of them, nicknamed Grizz, a nickname Harper explained later came from a bear encounter in Alaska, though the details were classified, had a crowd of little ones huddled around him while he showed them how to make balloon animals out of surgical gloves. The juxtaposition was almost absurd. Elite warriors with combat experience playing like uncles at a family reunion. But it was real, and it was beautiful in its simplicity. Meanwhile, Harper took a moment to sit on the edge of the pool, dipping her legs into the cool water. She watched Milo chase bubbles across the surface, his laughter so free that it made her throat tighten unexpectedly. These days are rare. These moments of peace, of unburdened joy, they were the kind she stored away in the quiet places of her heart to be remembered when the days turned long and hard again. The deployment had cost her in ways no one at this pool would ever fully understand. Not just time, but energy, emotion, the soul tax of being the one who had to stay strong while the world around her crumbled. And still, she had asked for nothing. The truth is, Harper had nearly canceled the birthday altogether. The idea of celebrating without Aaron had sat heavy on her chest for weeks. It felt hollow. It felt unfair. But Milo had circled the day on his little wall calendar with a marker and written "pool party" in crooked letters. He'd counted down each night, asking if there would be cake, if his friends would come, if Daddy could send a message. Harper had managed to get Aaron on a grainy video call the day before, just long enough for him to whisper "Happy birthday" and blow a kiss across the screen. Milo had kissed the tablet screen in return, satisfied with the exchange in the way only a child could be. Harper had wiped her eyes before he saw. So she showed up today, not to celebrate, but to survive. But what unfolded had become something far more powerful. The brotherhood had shown up, not out of obligation, but out of love. Each of those men had served alongside Aaron in one operation or another, and each of them had his own reasons for honoring that promise to show up for his son's 4th birthday. Not one of them had asked for details. Harper had sent a single text, and they'd coordinated flights, pooled hotel points, rented cars, and arrived in full force without hesitation. Because to them, this was not a pool party. It was a mission. And in some ways, it mattered more than the ones they'd done in uniform. Back by the shallow end, Lorraine now stood with a group of neighborhood parents who had gathered nearby. She listened intently as one of the moms, a woman named Emily, whose own husband had never served a day but had family in the army, expressed how moved she was by what she was witnessing. Others chimed in, noting how respectful the SEALs were, how gentle with the kids, how Harper had never once raised her voice or demanded attention. The party had lifted the mood of the entire pool, made it more welcoming, more joyful. Lorraine nodded thoughtfully, her clipboard held at her side now, like an afterthought. She was beginning to see something Karen never would, that real strength was quiet, steady, and often came wrapped in unexpected forms. Karen, for her part, had not left. She remained seated on her lounge chair, staring through sunglasses dark enough to obscure her eyes, her posture stiff as a board. Her phone rested on her lap, but she didn't scroll. Occasionally, she tapped the screen, pretending to answer messages, but it was clear her mind wasn't in it. She had lost her audience. No one was rallying to her side. No one was asking what the issue had been. She had gone from self-appointed enforcer to background scenery. And the shift was unbearable for someone who had built her identity on control. Harper eventually walked over, not to confront her, but to extend an olive branch or maybe just a piece of birthday cake. She offered a small plate with a neatly cut square, pink frosting swirled on top, and simply said thank you for raising concerns, that it was important the community felt safe and heard. It wasn't sarcasm, it wasn't a dig, it was grace. And that, more than anything, made Karen's expression falter. She didn't take the cake, didn't say anything, but the silence wasn't defiant anymore. It was unsure, conflicted. As the sun dipped lower and the pool began to empty, the party slowly wound down. Parents collected towels and bags, children wrapped in oversized floaties trudged toward the parking lot, and the SEALs began their subtle cleanup, restoring the deck to how they found it. Not one crumb was left behind, not one toy abandoned. They operated with the same precision they might use disassembling a camp after a long mission. Harper thanked each of them, one by one, with a hug or a quiet word, and each of them responded with a nod of respect that needed no translation. Lorraine approached one final time, asking if Harper might be willing to come to the next HOA meeting and speak, not about this event, but about what it meant to build community. Harper smiled, hesitant but polite, and said she'd think about it. She wasn't looking to lead anything, but she understood the power of showing up. And as she buckled Milo into his booster seat and loaded the empty cake box into her trunk, she didn't look back at the pool. She didn't need to. She had brought light into a place that hadn't known it was dimming. And the ripples of that day would continue long after the last balloon deflated. The day after the pool party dawned with a quiet stillness that felt almost surreal. The laughter and chaos, the splashes and echoes of kids running barefoot on concrete, the click of Lorraine's clipboard, and the tension from Karen's sour expressions all had dissipated, leaving only sun-warmed sidewalks and neatly trimmed lawns behind. In the Lane household, the hum of the dishwasher mixed with the soft clink of dishes as Harper moved through the kitchen with the careful, efficient rhythm of someone used to making the most of quiet moments. Milo sat at the breakfast table, legs swinging, humming a made-up tune, while scribbling pictures with a crayon clutched tightly in his fingers. His drawing was of the pool, of course. Blue lines for water, stick figures with big arms, likely the SEALs, and a small figure in the corner with a bright yellow circle for a face. "That's Mommy," he'd said proudly. Harper smiled as she wiped down the counters, but there was a weight behind her eyes that even rest couldn't erase. The party had been a success, more than she had dared to hope. But underneath the sweetness of the cupcakes and the joy of Milo's smiles was the deeper ache that never quite left her. The ache of Aaron's absence, the ache of always being strong because she had to be. She hadn't spoken much of it to anyone, not even the men who had shown up for her yesterday. They all understood, of course, in their own way, but understanding didn't lessen the burden. It just made it easier to carry for a while.
The seals had all departed by morning, some catching early flights, others driving long hours back to their bases or families. A few had left notes taped to Harper's front door. Short, handwritten messages with words like, "Proud of you," "You're never alone," and "Mission accomplished." One had left a tactical folding knife in a gift-wrapped box with a post-it note that read, "For future Karen encounters." Just kidding. Sort of. Harper chuckled at that one and placed it carefully in her drawer, unsure if she'd ever use it, but grateful nonetheless. But while her world was returning to its quieter rhythm, the rest of Riverview Heights was buzzing. The pool party had not been unnoticed, and not just by those who had attended. Photos had begun circulating on the community Facebook group. Some showed Milo blowing out candles with the help of a man twice his size. Others featured seals tossing water balloons or building a fort out of pool chairs and towels for the kids. There was a particularly popular one of Harper crouched down next to a group of children, smiling as she handed out cupcakes.
That image, more than any, seemed to capture something people hadn't expected: warmth, humility, strength. The kind of quiet authority that contrasted starkly with the noise Karen had brought to the table. The online comments had been cautiously optimistic at first, but as more parents chimed in with their first-hand accounts, the tone shifted. Words like inspiring, heartwarming, and humbling appeared repeatedly. Even those who had never served in the military or had any connection to it began expressing appreciation for what the day had represented. It wasn't just a party, they realized. It was a moment that had revealed what real service and sacrifice looked like. Karen, predictably, had posted her own response, a lengthy, passive-aggressive message dripping with coded language about respecting community rules, the importance of fairness, and how some residents were intimidated by the presence of strangers with questionable backgrounds. But unlike before, her comments weren't met with the usual chorus of support. Instead, several residents pushed back, politely but firmly. One mother asked if she had actually spoken to Harper. Another pointed out that the men in question were all veterans who had served the country with distinction. A third simply said, "Maybe instead of policing joy, we should be grateful someone brought it here." That comment was legged by over 50 people in less than an hour. Lorraine, too, had weighed in. Her comment was brief but definitive. "The Lane family is welcome at the Riverview Heights Pool anytime. Let's build a community we can be proud of." Coming from her, it was as good as law. The conversation shifted after that. Karen went silent. Later that afternoon, Harper stood on her front porch watering a row of lavender she'd planted months ago but never had time to truly tend. The scent drifted in the air, calming and familiar. Across the street, Emily, one of the moms from the party, walked over with a small box in her hands. Inside was a hand-drawn card from her son and a neatly folded flyer for an upcoming neighborhood BBQ. She said, "I know you probably keep to yourself, but we'd love to have you there. And if you want help with anything, Milo's schooling, errands, just say the word." Harper smiled, surprised by how much that offer meant. It was a small gesture, but it marked a shift. For the first time since she moved into Riverview Heights, she felt seen not as a woman with a past people didn't understand, but as someone who belonged. She hadn't realized how much she'd braced herself for judgment until the warmth of genuine kindness began to trickle in. People weren't just tolerating her presence anymore. They were inviting her in. That evening, after tucking Milo into bed and reading his favorite picture book twice, at his insistence, Harper sat on her back porch sipping tea as the sun set. Crickets chirped and a soft breeze rustled the trees. She allowed herself a deep breath, the kind she used to take only between medevac missions, when she had just a few minutes to reset before being called back into chaos. This breath was different. It wasn't about bracing for the next fight. It was about absorbing the quiet victory. Because something had changed, not just in the neighborhood, but in her. She'd come back from deployment thinking she had to stay small to avoid conflict, to raise her son quietly and not disrupt the curated peace of suburban life. But life had reminded her, through 20 seals and a poolside showdown, that staying small wasn't her nature. She wasn't built for shrinking. She was built for impact.
And without raising her voice or breaking a single rule, she had made one. She hadn't just stood her ground, she'd shifted it. And the neighborhood would never be the same. The days following the pool party settled into a strange equilibrium, as if the very ground beneath Riverview Heights had subtly realigned. It wasn't anything drastic or loud, no new neighborhood mandates or overt apologies, but rather a quiet recalibration of attitudes. People greeted Harper a little more openly on her morning walks with Milo, nods turning into smiles, smiles into short but sincere conversations. The same parents who once avoided eye contact now asked how Milo was adjusting to preschool, whether Harper had family nearby, or if she needed anything from the store while they were out. It was clear that the silent majority had made their decision. Harper was not just tolerated, she was welcome. But not everyone was at peace with the change. Karen, once the queen of whispered rules and poolside scrutiny, had withdrawn in ways both noticeable and petty. She no longer strutted through the HOA park with the same clipped steps or hovered over her clipboard at community meetings. Instead, she had adopted a quieter campaign of resentment, leaving passive-aggressive comments on the community forum, making pointed remarks during HOA gatherings about procedural fairness, and even filing a thinly veiled complaint about unauthorized outside guests compromising pool safety. It was an attempt to claw back some control, but few took the bait. Even her closest allies had grown distant, wary of being pulled into another public embarrassment. For Harper, the slow thaw of her neighbors came with a mix of relief and caution. She'd been down this road before, in other towns, other bases, where friendliness turned quickly to coldness the moment her background became inconvenient. But this time felt different. Something had shifted in the eyes of the people around her, especially in the wake of what the SEALs had done, not just by showing up, but by showing who they were through actions rather than noise. Their discipline, their grace, their unspoken loyalty had left an impression deeper than any speech ever could. Harper knew she hadn't just stood her ground, she'd shifted it. And the Riverview Heights would never be the same.
One afternoon, while Harper was watering her small garden out front, Lorraine pulled up in her beige sedan, stepping out with a brown envelope tucked under one arm and her usual no-nonsense demeanor. She approached with purpose, the scent of lavender and dry mulch drifting between them in the late summer heat. Lorraine didn't waste time. She handed Harper the envelope and explained it was from the HOA, an official invitation to speak at the upcoming community town hall, not just as a resident, but as a guest of honor. Harper blinked in surprise. Lorraine clarified that the board had voted unanimously, something she noted was about as rare as a solar eclipse around here. Harper opened the envelope after Lorraine left, reading the formal language that invited her to share a few words about her experiences as a military family, perspectives on community, and the value of support networks. It was phrased like a TED Talk assignment, but Harper could sense the genuine intention behind it. It wasn't about checking a diversity box. It was about shifting the story. The neighborhood had seen what quiet strength looked like, and now they wanted to hear from the woman who embodied it. She placed the letter on her kitchen counter, unsure whether she would accept. Public speaking wasn't her preference. She had always done her work behind the scenes, patching up the wounded, managing chaos in the back of a speeding transport, and giving orders with precision that saved lives. Talking about herself in front of a microphone felt foreign, vulnerable. That evening, as she tucked Milo into bed, he asked if the pool uncles were coming back soon. She smiled, brushed his hair back gently, and said maybe, if he was lucky, they'd visit again for Christmas. He grinned, satisfied, and turned over with his teddy bear tucked under his chin. Harper lingered at the door after turning out the light. She realized then that maybe it wasn't about the speech. Maybe it was about what it would mean for Milo, for other children in the neighborhood, for anyone quietly watching from the sidelines who had ever been judged too quickly or dismissed too easily. 2 days later, she emailed Lorraine with a single line. "I'll do it." Word spread quickly. The next community newsletter announced Harper Lane as a guest speaker for the fall town hall. The buzz built with surprising momentum.
Some residents expressed genuine excitement, others curiosity. Even those who didn't know Harper well found themselves talking about her. It wasn't common for anyone outside of the usual board members to be featured in those meetings, and certainly not someone who had once been accused of violating pool protocol. Karen, upon reading the announcement, turned pale and left early from a committee luncheon, muttering something about declining standards. But her protests no longer carried the same sting. She'd overplayed her hand, and the neighborhood had stopped playing her game. As the evening of the town hall approached, Harper wrestled with her nerves. It wasn't fear. It was responsibility. She didn't want to waste the platform or make it about herself. She wanted to speak to something deeper, to the way judgment corrodes communities, to the quiet strength it takes to stay kind in the face of suspicion, and to the reality that people often have stories more complicated than they appear. She drafted notes on scrap paper, discarded most of them, and then started again. What she finally wrote was simple, but honest. The night of the meeting arrived with a surprisingly full crowd. The community center, usually half empty with bored attendees and lukewarm coffee, was buzzing. Chairs were filled. Neighbors who'd never attended before had come, including families who'd been at the pool party and those who had only heard about it secondhand. Harper sat near the back, waiting until her name was called. She wore a plain blouse and jeans, her hair pulled into a loose braid, and held her notes with steady hands. When she was introduced, she stood and walked to the front with quiet confidence. There was no music, no spotlight, just a microphone, a room full of people, and a woman who had once been nearly kicked out of the community pool for celebrating her son's birthday. She looked around at the faces watching her, some curious, some skeptical, but many warm, expectant. She cleared her throat, smiled gently, and began. And as her voice rose to fill the space, calm and steady, the story of what happened that day at the pool began to evolve from neighborhood gossip into something more lasting. A memory, yes, but also a lesson, a turning point, and for some, the beginning of true understanding. Harper had spoken for less than 10 minutes, but by the time she stepped away from the microphone, the room had shifted in a way that felt almost physical. It wasn't about applause, though there had been some, polite and scattered at first, then building into something more cohesive. It wasn't about gasps or any theatrical reaction. What settled over the room was quieter than that, a kind of reckoning, like a veil had lifted, and everyone was finally seeing her not as a category, military spouse, single mom, rule bender, but as a person, as someone who had carried more than her share and never once demanded recognition for it. She hadn't spoken in metaphors or tugged at heartstrings. She had simply told the truth. She'd started with her childhood in Iowa, how she grew up with a father who ran a hardware store and a mother who was more comfortable with a wrench than a whisk. She talked about falling in love with Connor, about how their early years were spent moving from base to base, always packing boxes just when things started to feel stable.
She talked about learning emergency field medicine on the fly, about patching up Marines under the roar of chopper blades and stitching wounds with trembling hands because there wasn't anyone else to do it. She mentioned Connor's final deployment only briefly, never using the word widow, just saying he didn't come back and that life hadn't paused to grieve with her. She still had a child to raise, a future to build, a world to make safe one small day at a time. And she ended by talking about Riverview Heights, not bitterly, not accusingly, but honestly. How it had been hard at first, how being judged on what you looked like or what others thought you were always is, but also how things had changed, how some neighbors had reached out, how kindness had arrived in small but meaningful gestures, how the day at the pool, painful as it was, had shown her something unexpected, that sometimes when truth and strength show up, even if late, they still matter, that healing begins in uncomfortable conversations and shifts in perspective. She hadn't named Karen once. She didn't have to. After the meeting, people approached her with new eyes. Men who once only nodded gave her firm handshakes. Women who had avoided her at the playground now leaned in, asking about Milo's favorite toys or what branch of the military her husband had served in. Someone offered to help with babysitting. Another suggested starting a support group for military spouses in the neighborhood. These weren't grand, sweeping gestures, but they were real, and Harper accepted them with cautious grace. She knew that some apologies came without words, and that change often started with showing up. Still, not everyone was thrilled by the ripple effect. Karen sat stiffly during Harper's talk, arms crossed, lips pressed so tightly they disappeared into her face. She hadn't clapped, hadn't made eye contact, and now, days later, she was doubling down on her old tactics. She began insisting on stricter enforcement of HOA rules, issuing citations for minor violations, and making comments online about emotional manipulation and performative storytelling. But the tide had turned. Fewer and fewer people were listening. Even her longtime lieutenant on the HOA board, Marcia, had begun questioning her approach, suggesting maybe it was time for fresh leadership. Karen brushed it off with a brittle smile, but the undercurrent was there. She could feel it. The authority she once wielded so easily was slipping. Harper, for her part, didn't engage. She continued living her life, walking Milo to the bus stop in the morning, tending to her tomato plants in the afternoon, and volunteering part-time at the local VA clinic. She had started connecting with other military families in the area, organizing informal gatherings at the park or backyard barbecues. Her house had become a quiet hub of support, never loud or flashy, just open. She kept things simple, but her door was always unlocked during the day, and the coffee pot was usually full. Then, one Saturday morning, a curious envelope arrived at her doorstep. It was crisp, sealed with a wax insignia, and addressed simply, "To the one who never asked for thanks." Harper frowned, turning it over in her hands before opening it. Inside was a thick, engraved card and a handwritten note. The card was an invitation to a closed-door recognition ceremony at the nearby Navy base, a tradition among elite SEAL teams to honor civilians who had shown extraordinary character or made a quiet but powerful impact on their lives. The note, written in strong, looping handwriting, simply read, "You didn't just open your backyard to us. You reminded us why we fight. We are not done saying thank you." Harper stared at it for a long time, unsure whether to laugh or cry. The card included a date and time, a dress code, and instructions to bring no guests. It wasn't public. It wasn't performative. It was something more sacred, an internal circle of honor not often extended beyond the brotherhood. She wasn't sure why they were doing it now, but deep down she felt the weight of what it meant. These men, some of the most disciplined, selective, and silent warriors alive, had chosen her, not because she had asked for it, but because she hadn't. She kept the invitation in her drawer and didn't mention it to anyone. She went about her days as usual, though something about her movements became quieter, more reflective. When Milo spilled juice on the carpet or her neighbor's dog dug into her garden, she didn't react with her usual teasing exasperation. There was a stillness about her, the kind that only comes from being seen in a way that transcends validation. She didn't need to prove anything anymore. Meanwhile, Karen grew louder. Her posts became more frequent and erratic. She complained that the neighborhood had lost its backbone, that rules were being ignored in favor of sentimental storytelling. She argued that discipline and standards were being replaced by pity and emotion. But the more she shouted, the more she became invisible. Her voice, once dominant, had turned into white noise, unwelcome and ignorable. And in the quiet, something else took root. A new culture began to form, one built not on judgment, but on earned respect. It didn't require official titles or forced politeness. It simply asked people to show up, to listen, to acknowledge what they didn't know, and to grow. And through it all, Harper moved forward, unaware that the next chapter was already being written, one that would not only confirm who she was, but remind everyone watching that grace, when paired with strength, can change everything. The morning of Milo's birthday arrived with the kind of calm that always made Harper suspicious. There was no last-minute frosting disaster, no unexpected tantrum, no missing party favors.
just a stillness in the air, as if the entire day had taken a breath and was waiting for something to unfold.
Harper had planned a modest backyard celebration. Balloons were tied to the fence, a folding table held a tray of cupcakes, and a homemade Happy Birthday Milo banner flapped lazily in the wind. Nothing extravagant, just enough to make her son feel seen. She had made it clear to Milo that this year wouldn't include bounce houses or magicians, but he hadn't minded. He was a thoughtful kid, the kind who found joy in the little things. When she asked what he wanted most, he simply said, "I just want people to come." And come they did. By 10 in the morning, a handful of neighborhood kids were already running around with foam swords and water guns, their laughter echoing through the cul-de-sac. Parents stood chatting over coffee, many of them newer faces Harper had met through the community events she'd begun to organize. There was a subtle warmth to the gathering, one that hadn't existed a few months ago. Fences that had once been figurative were now literal only. People lingered longer, smiled wider, and made space for one another in ways they hadn't before. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress. Still, Harper couldn't shake the feeling that something bigger was coming. There had been no RSVP from the Navy base, no indication that any of the SEALs she'd once supported were planning to show up. But then again, they were SEALs. If they were coming, she probably wouldn't know until the moment they did. She caught herself glancing toward the street more often than usual, pretending to check on parked cars or wave at arriving guests. Milo, blissfully unaware of her anticipation, was already knee-deep in a water balloon fight with two other boys from the block. At exactly 11:07 a.m., a deep, unmistakable rumble rolled down the road. Not just one engine, but a chorus of them, low, powerful, and perfectly synchronized. Heads turned, conversations paused mid-sentence. Harper's breath caught in her chest. Down the street, a caravan of black motorcycles rounded the corner. Not the flashy kind meant to impress, but solid, tactical machines that looked like they had seen more than just highways. Leading the pack was a truck, matte black, tinted windows, nothing ostentatious but undeniably authoritative. Behind it, 20 Navy SEALs on motorcycles rode 2 by 2, helmets glinting under the sun, American flag patches stitched onto their sleeves, silent and controlled. Gasps spread through the gathering like sparks on dry grass. Some kids froze, others whooped with excitement. Adults instinctively stepped aside, unsure if they were witnessing a parade or the beginning of something they weren't invited to. Harper stood frozen, hands clenched at her sides, pulse thudding like a drum line in her ears. The caravan came to a halt directly in front of her house. For a moment, no one moved. Then the truck door opened. From it stepped a man Harper hadn't seen in nearly 3 years, Lieutenant Commander Jack Sutter, tall, broad-shouldered, with eyes that missed nothing and a calm that made chaos obey. He wasn't in uniform, but he didn't need to be. His posture, the way he moved, even the silence around him, all of it screamed authority and respect. Without a word, he reached into the back seat of the truck and pulled out a large camo duffel bag. From inside, he retrieved a single item, a folded American flag in a triangular wooden case. He held it reverently, then began walking toward Harper's yard. The crowd parted. Children stepped back. Even the skeptical neighbors who had once whispered about Harper stood still, eyes wide and mouths slightly open. Jack stopped 3 feet from Harper and nodded once. "For Milo," he said simply. Harper stared, eyes stinging. She nodded back, unable to speak. Jack turned and handed the flag to Milo, who took it with both hands, blinking up at the man with quiet awe. "Your mom," he said to him, kneeling slightly, "helped save more lives than you'll ever know. She did it without asking for anything. That kind of service deserves honor." Milo looked at his mother, then hugged the flag tightly to his chest. Behind them, the SEALs dismounted.
some removing their helmets, others offering nods and salutes. One by one, they approached Harper, not with fanfare, but with sincerity. A handshake here, a hand on the shoulder, a murmured thank you passed between men trained never to show vulnerability. It wasn't a show. It was a moment of truth in a world too quick to forget what quiet heroism looks like. And, of course, standing on the sidewalk just a few houses down was Karen. She had come outside when the engines roared in, expecting perhaps some delinquent group disturbing the peace, ready with her phone camera and a list of HOA violations to rattle off. But what she saw stopped her cold. 20 Navy SEALs, decorated, disciplined, respected, standing at attention in front of the very woman she had tried to eject from a community pool. The woman she had mocked for having no place in their pristine neighborhood. Harper. Karen's face tightened, mouth moving as if to speak, but no words came. No one paid her any attention. Not anymore.
The SEALs began setting up additional gear. A grill appeared from the back of a truck. Coolers were unpacked. A custom cake concealed in an insulated case was revealed. 3 tiers, iced in blue and silver, with Milo spelled out in military stencil. One of the SEALs took out a portable speaker, and music floated into the yard. The birthday party had just leveled up. But it wasn't the spectacle that moved people. It was the unity. Men who had fought in foreign lands, who had faced down death in places without names, now sat cross-legged in the grass, playing tag with kids and helping them build makeshift forts out of cardboard boxes. They weren't guests. They were family. Harper stood near the back porch, watching it all unfold, heart full and quiet. She didn't gloat. She didn't look toward Karen. She didn't need to, because now everyone saw her clearly. Not as a rule breaker, not as a widow, not even as a military spouse, but as a woman who had lived, given, sacrificed, and had finally been honored, not for what she had lost, but for who she had always been. And the party was just beginning. As the smell of sizzling meat rose from the grill and music drifted through the yard like a gentle breeze, something shifted in the atmosphere that day. It wasn't just about the birthday party anymore. What had started as a celebration for a boy turning 8 had quietly become a kind of reckoning for the neighborhood itself. A mirror held up to its values, its prejudices, its unspoken assumptions. The laughter of children, once sporadic and scattered, now rang out in constant waves. The SEALs, rugged and commanding in presence, were kneeling in the grass to help toddlers tie balloon animals and racing older kids around the fence line in mock drills that left them all breathless with laughter. These weren't men who sought recognition, yet every moment of kindness they extended now served as a correction to every sideways glance Harper had endured over the past year. They weren't here for applause. They were here for Harper and for Milo. And yet, standing just outside the ring of warmth and joy, Karen lingered like a storm cloud refusing to disperse. Arms crossed over her chest, jaw clenched tight, her expression flickered between disbelief and indignation. Her carefully curated perception of control, the power she thought she had over who belonged and who didn't, was cracking before her eyes. She had prided herself on maintaining standards for the neighborhood, casting herself as a guardian of decorum and propriety. But now, those standards were being quietly dismantled by a group of men who didn't ask permission to belong, because their mere presence redefined the rules. And the woman Karen had dismissed as just a single mom was at the center of it all. Harper saw her. Of course she did. She had seen Karen watching from the moment the first engine rumbled onto the street. She had seen her phone come up, recording briefly, then lower again when the weight of what she was witnessing settled in. But Harper didn't look away out of shame or anger. She just didn't have to. Everything Karen had tried to erase about her, her strength, her resilience, her place, was being affirmed in real time. For years, Harper had felt like a shadow version of herself, half seen by a society that preferred her quiet and compliant. But now she was luminous, seen clearly by those who mattered most. The guests who had initially arrived with quiet uncertainty now mingled freely.
One father, Mark, who had once stood silently by when Karen questioned Harper's pool membership, approached her with a plate of ribs and an awkward smile. He looked sheepish, almost embarrassed to be offering food to someone who had clearly earned far more than neighborly politeness. But Harper took the plate with a nod and a soft thank you, and Mark lingered a bit, chuckling nervously before saying, "I didn't know you were, well, that you'd done all that, that your husband was Navy, that you were, too. Really?" She had heard that before. Not in those exact words, but the sentiment, as if her identity needed to be tied to a man's to be validated. She smiled gently and said, "I didn't advertise it. Didn't think I had to." Mark nodded, and for once he seemed to truly listen, something shifting behind his eyes. Not pity, not guilt, but recognition, the kind that comes too late but still arrives with purpose. Milo was glowing, not just from the sugar or the excitement, but from something deeper, a confidence Harper hadn't seen in him before. The presence of the SEALs, whom he had only ever heard stories about in fragments, had created an unspoken legacy he now felt part of. Lieutenant Commander Jack had knelt beside him earlier and told him in front of everyone, "You come from warriors. That doesn't mean you fight with fists. It means you stand for what's right, even when no one else does." Milo had nodded solemnly, his small fingers gripping the flag case like a shield. Back at the edge of the yard, Harper finally approached Karen, not because she needed to confront her, but because she needed to free herself from the weight of unspoken tension. She found her leaning against the gate, pretending to scroll through her phone, though the screen was dark. Karen didn't look up until Harper was just a few feet away. "I suppose this wasn't in violation of any HOA rules," Harper said softly, her tone not mocking, but resolute. Karen straightened, unsure how to respond. Harper continued, "I didn't plan any of this, but maybe that's the point. Sometimes you don't get to control how things unfold. Sometimes people show up not because you invited them, but because they believe in you." Karen scoffed, a brittle sound that lacked conviction. "I wasn't trying to ruin anything," she muttered.
"I know," Harper said. "You were trying to protect something. An image, maybe. But what you were protecting wasn't community. It was control." She paused. "I'm not asking for your approval. I never was. Just your decency." Karen didn't respond, and Harper didn't wait for her to. She walked back toward the center of the yard where Milo was unwrapping gifts, a circle of SEALs cheering him on like uncles returning from sea. In that moment, Harper realized she didn't need everyone's validation, just the truth. And the truth was now inescapable. The rest of the afternoon unfolded like a dream. Games were played, speeches were made. One SEAL, gruff and tattooed, stood on a chair and shared a story about Milo's father, how he once risked his life to pull a wounded civilian out of crossfire during an overseas operation. He didn't talk much, the SEAL said, but when he did, it meant something. Just like Harper. He nodded to her. "You don't need to speak loud to be heard. You just need to speak true." By evening, as the sun dipped low and the last of the guests trickled away, Harper stood alone in the backyard, the remnants of the party around her. Empty plates, tipped-over cups, a banner half unraveled by wind. But the space felt sacred now, not for the decorations or the military spectacle, but for what had taken root, respect, earned and undeniable. Karen hadn't said another word. She had slipped away quietly, retreating behind the safety of her blinds. But the neighborhood had seen everything, and they would not forget. Harper, once invisible, now stood unshakably visible, not because she demanded attention, but because she had shown what it truly meant to belong. Night had settled over the neighborhood, blanketing the quiet cul-de-sac in soft hues of orange and indigo as porch lights flickered on one by one. The remnants of Milo's party slowly gave way to stillness, but the echo of the day's events lingered like the scent of barbecue smoke caught in the folds of the evening air. Harper stood alone on her back deck, arms wrapped around herself, not out of cold, but contemplation. The last of the guests had left with firm handshakes, meaningful glances, and half-whispered apologies that tried to bridge years of silent judgment. The silence that now surrounded her felt different,
less isolating, more earned. This was not the hollow quiet of exclusion she had grown accustomed to. This was peace. Inside the house, Milo had finally fallen asleep, still clutching the Navy SEAL challenge coin that Lieutenant Commander Jack had pressed into his palm during the cake-cutting moment. The boy had insisted on sleeping in his party clothes, his face smudged with frosting and his shirt damp with pool water and grass stands. She had kissed his forehead as he drifted off, whispering a silent thank you to whatever force had guided the day. She wasn't used to asking for help. In fact, she had trained herself not to. But today had reminded her that strength didn't always mean self-reliance. Sometimes true power meant letting others see your vulnerability and standing firm anyway. But Karen's face still haunted her thoughts. Not out of fear, Harper had long since stopped fearing women like Karen, but out of a deeper, more unsettling curiosity. What was it that made some people so resistant to change, so threatened by someone who simply existed outside their definition of normal? Karen hadn't said another word after their quiet confrontation by the gate. She hadn't needed to. Her retreat spoke louder than anything she could have yelled. And yet Harper knew the story wasn't over. People like Karen rarely left things alone. If anything, being proven wrong publicly only intensified their need to reclaim the illusion of control. Harper wasn't naive. She knew the fallout would come, not from the party, not from the SEALs, but from the subtle ripples of pride disrupted. The real test wouldn't be in the explosion, it would be in the quiet retaliation. Still, tonight was not about fear. Tonight was about the spark that had been lit, not just in her, but in Milo, in the neighbors who had come hesitant and left transformed, in the very soil of the community that had been so carefully manicured against disruption. Harper had opened a door, and what had entered was not chaos, but truth. Truth in the form of 20 disciplined, respectful men who carried scars and silence in equal measure. Men who did not boast of their deeds, but lived by a code so deeply ingrained that their presence alone was enough to shift the very atmosphere of a gathering. She replayed the moment in her mind, Jack stepping onto the lawn, a dozen of his men fanning out behind him like the turning of a tide. No introduction had been necessary. Their posture, their stillness, their quiet authority, it had said everything. She remembered the collective inhale of the crowd, the way every head had turned, the way even the children had grown silent in reverence. These were not just men in uniform. These were guardians of a different kind, men who understood the gravity of sacrifice and honored it not with parades, but with presence. She thought of Robert then, her late husband, Milo's father, the man whose absence had shaped every inch of their lives for the past 4 years. She had grieved him in silence, behind locked doors and pulled curtains, while the world moved on and forgot. There had been no community vigil, no casseroles delivered to her doorstep, just polite nods from distant neighbors, and the occasional awkward question about her plans for work. But now, in the wake of today, she realized that Robert hadn't been forgotten. His brothers in arms had carried his memory with them across deployments and distance, and today they had delivered it home, not in words, but in the way they stood beside her and called her sister.
From the corner of her eye, she saw movement near the fence line. For a moment, her breath caught, instinct tensing her shoulders before she recognized the silhouette. It was Officer Derek, the same local police officer who had driven past earlier in the day with a wary glance at the gathering crowd. Now, out of uniform and holding a folded lawn chair under one arm, he approached the gate with hesitation. Harper walked down the steps to meet him, curiosity furrowing her brow. "Didn't want to interrupt earlier," he said, offering a nod. "Figured I'd stop by after the dust settled." Harper raised an eyebrow. "Didn't realize there was dust to settle." Derek chuckled lightly, looking down at the grass. "Well, you'd be surprised how fast word spreads in this neighborhood. HOA's already buzzin'. But I just wanted to say, I was wrong. About you. About how you've been treated. What happened today, it mattered. Changed some minds." She didn't respond immediately. Instead, she let the silence stretch between them, weighing his words. Finally, she nodded. "Appreciate you saying that." He handed her a folded piece of paper. "I know there was talk about your pool access, some complaints filed anonymously last month. I reviewed them. Nothing holds water. You're in good standing. Thought you should have that in writing."
Harper took the paper, reading the brief statement confirming her access and status. It wasn't much, just words, but they marked a shift, a turning of the tide that had long worked against her. "Thanks, Derek. Really." As he turned to leave, he paused. "Those men, the ones who came today, they're the real deal, huh?" "They are," she said quietly. He gave a low whistle. "Milo's lucky." Harper watched him walk away and then return to the house. The kitchen was still littered with half-eaten cupcakes and plastic utensils, but to her, it looked like a battlefield after a victory. Small, unglamorous, and deeply meaningful. Tomorrow, she knew, the whispers would resume. There would be meetings, thinly veiled comments, maybe even another attempt to question her presence. But tonight, Harper had no doubt of where she stood, and more importantly, neither did anyone else. The next morning broke with the kind of golden light that gave the illusion of calm, the early sunlight filtering through the curtains in Harper's kitchen as she brewed her coffee in silence. The scent of strong, dark roast filled the room, mingling with the faint traces of chlorine still lingering from the backyard. It should have been a morning of relief, a moment to soak in what had happened the day before. The powerful vindication, the quiet respect, the meaningful glances of those who had once looked past her. But yet, there was something gnawing at Harper's gut. She knew from experience that moments like those didn't come without a cost. And as the silence of the house deepened, broken only by the soft hum of the refrigerator and the slow ticking of the wall clock, she began to feel the distant rumble of something building, something inevitable. Milo had slept in late, completely exhausted from the emotional high of the previous day. His birthday had become a legend overnight, at least among the kids. Harper's phone buzzed every hour with texts from parents she barely knew, thanking her for hosting such a unique and incredible event. A few tried to pass off their earlier silence as ignorance, as though they hadn't seen Karen's confrontation, or hadn't heard the subtle comments floating around the neighborhood for months. But Harper saw it for what it was: damage control. They didn't want to be on the wrong side now that the tide had turned. They weren't showing solidarity, they were showing fear of association. That was fine. She didn't need apologies from everyone. She just needed space. Space for her and Milo to live without constantly having to justify their presence. But that space wouldn't come easily, not in a neighborhood like Maple Hollow, where perfection was a sport and gossip was the primary currency. Just as Harper was rinsing out her mug, she heard a sharp knock at the front door. 3 measured raps. Precise. Almost rehearsed. She dried her hands and made her way to the door, a pit forming in her stomach before she even opened it. She already knew who would be standing on the other side. Karen stood there, her lips drawn into a tight line, her arms crossed as though she were bracing for war. She wore her usual athletic wear, hair pulled back into a severe ponytail, and an oversized pair of sunglasses that she removed slowly as Harper opened the door. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The air between them felt brittle, like a pane of glass ready to shatter. Karen finally asked, "May I come in?" Harper didn't move. "Depends on why you're here." Karen hesitated, clearly unused to being denied immediate compliance. She glanced behind her, as if making sure no one was watching, before stepping slightly closer. "Look, I don't want to make a scene." Harper raised an eyebrow. "Isn't that what you're best at?" Karen flinched at that, but pushed forward anyway. "I came to apologize, sort of." Harper leaned against the doorframe. "Sort of?" Karen looked down, fingers fidgeting with the hem of her sleeve. "Yesterday was a lot. I didn't know you had connections to the military like that. I didn't know that you deserve to be treated like a human being?" Harper cut in, her tone even. Karen's jaw tensed, and for a moment Harper saw the usual indignation begin to rise in her eyes. But then it faltered, replaced by something more complicated. "No, I didn't know you were one of them." Karen's voice dropped slightly. "One of who?" "A widow. Of a SEAL. People talk, but no one really knew. And when those men showed up, it just changed things."
Harper's breath caught in her chest, not from surprise, but from anger, wrapped in exhaustion. "So let me get this straight. I was beneath you, a nuisance, a problem, until 20 uniformed men appeared in my yard and made you feel small? That's when you decided to see me?" Karen blinked, caught off guard by the bluntness. "It's not that simple." "But it is," Harper replied, stepping fully into the doorway now. "I was here for years, keeping to myself, raising my son, paying my dues, and every step of the way, you made it clear I didn't belong. Not because I did anything wrong, but because I didn't fit your mold. And now that your mold cracked, you want to smooth things over." Karen opened her mouth, but no words came. Instead, she looked around the porch, as if searching for something she could latch onto, something she could fix. But there was nothing. No misstep, no opening, just the weight of her own assumptions. Harper let the silence hang before continuing. "You don't need to apologize for not knowing my past. You need to apologize for not believing I had one worth knowing." Karen's shoulders sagged, the facade beginning to crumble. I just thought you were being difficult, refusing to comply with the HOA guidelines, acting like the rules didn't apply to you." "I wasn't acting. The rules were being weaponized. There's a difference." Karen nodded slowly, her eyes betraying a mix of realization and regret. "You're right. I didn't see it before, and I don't expect forgiveness. But I needed to say something." Harper studied her for a long moment. There was no satisfaction in watching Karen squirm. There was only the weary ache of someone who had fought for basic respect and was now being offered it conditionally. Too little, too late. But there was also a strange calm in knowing that the truth had spoken for itself, not in grand gestures, but in the quiet way truth always does, by enduring. "You said your piece. Now you can go." Karen nodded, turned, and walked away without another word. Harper didn't watch her leave. Instead, she closed the door gently, turned back into the house, and exhaled a breath she didn't know she had been holding. Later that day, a small envelope arrived in the mailbox. No return address, just her name in tidy cursive. Inside was a handwritten note from one of the HOA board members. It read simply, "We got it wrong. We're correcting the record. Starting with you." Harper smiled, not because it changed everything, but because it proved that change, however slow, was still possible. For the first time in days, the chaos that had circled like a storm over that sunny suburban pool began to shift, not through any apology or compromise, but through a presence so commanding that even the most stubborn egos shrank back. The 20 Navy SEALs didn't arrive with fanfare. They came in waves, some from vehicles parked discreetly up the block, others on foot, walking casually but with unmistakable coordination. Their arrival wasn't loud, but it was thunderous in its effect. They wore no uniforms, no overt insignias, but the way they carried themselves left no doubt about their background. Broad shoulders, perfect posture, cool, alert eyes scanning every detail. They might as well have worn their tridents on their sleeves. Every parent who had jeered earlier, every lifeguard who had turned their back on Natalie, every whispering bystander who had judged her faded t-shirt and quiet strength, suddenly they all began to feel like they were part of a bad dream that had just been interrupted by something far bigger than them. One of the SEALs, a tall man with salt and pepper hair and a calm but razor-sharp demeanor, stepped forward and gave Natalie a brief nod. That one gesture said it all. It said they knew who she was, they knew what she had done, and they were here for her. Not out of duty, but out of deep, unwavering respect. Karen, who had been ranting only minutes before about rules and image and how people should behave in nice communities, had gone pale. Her mouth opened slightly, and for once, no sound came out. She recognized it too, not just that these men were different, but that the woman she had berated wasn't just a tired single mom with army boots and a military haircut. Natalie was something Karen couldn't wrap her head around. A warrior, a protector, someone who had stood in places Karen couldn't pronounce and faced horrors she couldn't imagine. Natalie didn't gloat. She didn't point fingers or throw words back at Karen. She simply stepped forward with her son, gave a gentle nod to the SEALs, and led them to the small decorated table by the pool where the birthday party had been so brutally interrupted. And that's when it happened. Dozens of decorated warfighters, some with shrapnel scars barely concealed under casual polos and jeans, began singing happy birthday to Owen. It wasn't perfect. Some of them were out of tune. One even cracked a joke halfway through. But it was real. It was heartfelt.
It was louder than any insult that had been thrown. And in that moment, the sound of 20 Navy SEALs singing for a little boy who thought no one would show up to his birthday party pierced through every layer of shame and small-mindedness that had lingered in that pool.
"Happy birthday," he mumbled. "Sorry about earlier." That small moment cracked the dam. More kids followed, tentatively at first, then in groups, drawn by the atmosphere that had shifted entirely. The table that had once been a sad, untouched spot now buzzed with laughter, presence, and activity. The Navy SEALs mingled easily, joking with the kids, helping with party games, even cannonballing into the deep end like giant playful uncles. They didn't have to do any of it, but they did. Because Natalie wasn't just a medic or a friend, she was family. The lifeguards who had watched coldly from the sidelines now looked anywhere but at her. One of them, a young man who had joined in the sneering earlier in the week, walked over and cleared his throat awkwardly. "Miss Parker, I didn't know. I didn't realize. You save people like them?" Natalie looked up, her eyes steady but kind. "I don't need you to realize anything about me. Just don't treat people like they're less. You never know who's fighting a war you can't see." The young lifeguard swallowed hard and nodded before walking away, head low, understanding the weight of what had just been handed to him. Karen remained by the pool chairs, now completely isolated. No one backed her up. Her friends had vanished into the parking lot. Her husband had retreated behind his sunglasses and his silence. She sat still, watching her perfectly manicured image crumble with every laugh that came from the party she'd tried to destroy. Natalie didn't acknowledge her again. She didn't have to. The lesson had already been delivered, more powerfully than any argument ever could. The party continued late into the afternoon, with the sun casting long golden reflections on the water and the sound of joy echoing across the pool. Natalie stood slightly to the side, arms crossed, eyes soft as she watched Owen finally run around like a normal kid, surrounded by people who saw him, not for what his mother wore, but for the honor she carried in silence. The community had been shaken, and not by anger or vengeance, but by truth, a truth wrapped in laughter, in friendship, and in the unexpected reverence of warriors who had seen the worst of humanity and chose to show its best. And beneath all of it was the quiet resolve of a mother who had never needed to prove anything, but who on this day proved everything. As the party wound down and the last rays of sunlight stretched lazily across the concrete deck of the community pool, the mood had transformed from tense and uncomfortable to quietly celebratory. Not the kind of celebration found in loud parties or dazzling decorations, but something more grounded, more profound, the kind that lingers in the heart like a warm afterglow. The cake had been reduced to crumbs and smudged frosting, the balloons drooped in the heat, and kids clutched goodie bags filled with mismatched toys and stickers. Yet no one was in a hurry to leave. The pool was quieter now, the water rippling gently as if it too had exhaled a long-held breath. Owen was sitting cross-legged with two other boys on a towel, their heads bent close as they compared superhero trading cards given by one of the SEALs. There was a look on Owen's face that Natalie hadn't seen in months. Contentment. Not the shy, uncertain kind, but the deep-rooted kind that grows only when a child feels safe and seen. Natalie stood a few feet away, arms folded, her military instincts never quite switched off, but for once her shoulders weren't tight with tension. She scanned the pool area, not out of suspicion but habit, noting who remained and who quietly chose not to return after the earlier humiliation. The SEALs were still there, albeit fewer now. Some had already peeled away in pairs, offering quiet nods or slaps on the back as they left, never lingering long. But a core few remained, the older ones who had served with Natalie in Afghanistan, the ones who had seen her sprint through machine gun fire to save a bleeding comrade, or crawl into a collapsed compound to treat children no one else dared to approach. They remembered, and that memory had turned into something tangible today. Not just a reunion, but a reminder. Chief Warrant Officer Ryan Drake stood beside Natalie now, arms crossed, watching Owen with a faint smile. He had been the one who led the impromptu birthday chorus, and who had, with a few measured words, melted the invisible wall that had been holding the community hostage. He didn't speak much, never had to. His presence spoke louder than most voices ever could. "He's a good kid," he finally said, his voice a low rumble. "Got his mom's eyes." Natalie smirked, not taking her eyes off Owen. "And his father's stubborn streak. But yeah, he's good. Better than I could have hoped." Ryan shifted slightly, his gaze scanning the horizon. "You held it together well today. Most would have snapped." Natalie's jaw tensed, then relaxed. "I've been through worse. But yeah, today cut deeper than I expected." It was the truth. She had survived ambushes, trauma bays overflowing with casualties, and months of mental fog during reintegration. But today had been personal. Today had tried to strip her of dignity in front of her son, in front of strangers who didn't deserve to define her. And yet, in a strange twist of fate, it had become a day of transformation, not just for her, but for everyone who had borne witness to the quiet destruction of judgment. Ryan nodded, as if hearing all the words she hadn't said. "You did more than hold your own. You changed the weather here. The whole atmosphere shifted." Natalie glanced at him. "Maybe."
Or maybe they'll just forget in a week and go back to judging the next mom who doesn't fit their idea of normal. Ryan gave a soft grunt. Maybe some will, but not all. That lifeguard kid? He looked shaken. And that one dad? The one who laughed when Karen threw your towel? He came up to me just now. Said he didn't know you were military. Said he didn't know how much his behavior mirrored everything he claimed to hate. Natalie raised an eyebrow. And what did he say? Ryan's smirk deepened. Told him it shouldn't matter whether you were or weren't, that respect isn't earned through status. It's owed through decency. They fell into a comfortable silence after that, the kind born from old foxholes and quiet post-mission rides. Natalie appreciated that about Ryan. He never tried to fix her. He just showed up, and let that be enough. Across the pool deck, Karen still sat alone, the once commanding woman now dwarfed by the realization of her own irrelevance. Her designer sunglasses were gone, likely packed away in shame or forgotten. She had tried to leave earlier, but something had held her in place. Pride, perhaps, or the inability to face the walk of shame through the community she once ruled like a self-appointed queen. But now, as the guests trickled out and the shadows lengthened, she finally rose, brushing imaginary dust from her blouse. Her steps were slower, less confident, and as she passed Natalie on her way to the exit, there was a brief moment, just one, where their eyes met. Karen stopped, opened her mouth as if to speak, then closed it again. Words failed her. What apology could capture the full weight of her actions? What excuse could bridge the chasm she had created? Natalie gave her the smallest of nods. Not forgiveness, not even acknowledgement, just a nod. A signal that she saw her. That maybe, if Karen did the hard work of change, redemption wasn't impossible. Karen blinked, then turned and walked out of the gate, the loud clang behind her sounding more like an ending than an exit. Natalie let out a slow breath and turned her attention back to the party area, now in cleanup mode. Owen was helping one of the SEALs gather trash, mimicking the man's posture like a tiny soldier in training. Natalie felt a swell of pride, not just in her son, but in the village that had risen around him today. A village of warriors, of courage, of unexpected allies who showed up not with weapons, but with presence, compassion, and truth. The lessons of the day weren't lost on her. Judgment comes quick. Respect takes longer. But when truth walks into the room, even silently, it speaks louder than anything else.
And sometimes, when the world tries to erase your worth, all it takes is the echo of 20 boots walking in step beside you to remind them exactly who you are. The sun had fully dipped below the horizon, casting the entire pool area in a blanket of twilight. The lights lining the fence flickered on one by one, casting soft halos of gold across the now quiet water. The birthday streamers danced gently in the breeze, their edges fluttering like the last breaths of a long day. Most of the guests had departed, the sound of car engines and laughter fading into the distance, but Natalie lingered. She sat on the edge of a pool chair, her legs crossed, a bottle of water sweating in her hand as she watched Owen trail his fingers across the surface of the water. He was humming to himself, oblivious to the weight of what the day had meant. For him, it had become a birthday worth remembering. For Natalie, it had become something far more profound, a reclamation of identity, a reminder of the strength she had never truly lost, and a quiet validation that who she was had always been enough. Ryan had said his goodbyes a few minutes earlier, with a firm handshake and a brief, meaningful glance. The other SEALs had filed out with casual precision, their roles fulfilled, their presence leaving an invisible imprint on the place. They didn't need to linger. The message had been sent, and more importantly, received. The community had been jolted from its judgment, confronted with the truth they hadn't anticipated, that Natalie wasn't some out-of-place single mother with a mysterious aura, but a decorated Navy Corps man with a storied past and an ironclad sense of purpose. She hadn't needed to announce her accolades or parade her sacrifice. It had been enough for those who knew her truth to show up, and in doing so, dismantle every shallow assumption the onlookers had made. As Natalie sat in that golden hush of early evening, she thought back on the many quiet battles she had fought since leaving active duty. The struggle to reintegrate into civilian life without losing herself. The stares and whispers when she'd corrected someone's outdated views about women in the military. The uncomfortable parent-teacher meetings where she was treated like a side character in her own child's life. The endless moments where she'd bitten her tongue rather than explain that her visible strength was born from nights spent holding pressure to bullet wounds and whispering comfort to dying men far from home. The truth was, society didn't always know what to do with women like her. Strong, scarred, unapologetically capable. But today, all the silent victories she had stored away found their moment of expression. She reached down and trailed her own fingers in the water, watching the ripples merge with Owen's. He looked up at her then, his face open and honest. "Mom, did you see how cool the guys were today?" he asked, his eyes bright with wonder. Natalie smiled. "Yeah, I saw. They thought you were pretty cool too." Owen grinned, then became quiet for a moment. "Why did that lady hate us so much?"
We weren't doing anything wrong. Natalie took a long breath before answering, knowing the weight of her words would stay with him. Sometimes people judge what they don't understand. They see someone who doesn't look like them, live like them, or act the way they expect, and instead of being curious, they get scared or angry. But that's not your problem to carry, okay? You keep being kind and strong and true to yourself. That's how we change the world. Owen nodded solemnly, the wisdom of her words settling into his young heart like a seed ready to grow. He climbed out of the pool and wrapped his towel around his shoulders, standing taller than he had that morning. "I want to be like you when I grow up. Brave and good." Natalie looked at her son and felt tears sting the corners of her eyes. Not from sadness, but from the overwhelming realization that the example she had fought so hard to embody had taken root exactly where it needed to. She stood and ruffled his wet hair. "You already are, kiddo." They began packing up their things slowly, folding the leftover paper plates, collecting discarded water bottles, and gathering forgotten flip-flops. As they did, a few neighbors cautiously approached. One or two moms, the lifeguard from earlier, and even the man who had once laughed alongside Karen. They didn't come with fanfare or dramatic apologies, but with something more meaningful: sincerity. The first mom, a woman in a plain sundress with tired eyes, stepped forward. "Natalie, I didn't realize. About your service, I mean. I'm sorry I didn't step in earlier."
Natalie gave a small smile. Thank you. But really, it's not about knowing someone's background to treat them with respect. It's about giving everyone that respect from the start. The lifeguard nodded, his face flushed. I should have handled it differently. You were right. I froze. I'll do better next time. That's all anyone can do. And she meant it. Each conversation was brief but healing. The environment that had once buzzed with judgment and dismissal had shifted into one of quiet reflection and growth. The experience had left an imprint, not just on those who had witnessed it, but on the culture of the place itself. Natalie didn't expect miracles, but she believed in momentum. And this, right here, felt like forward motion. By the time they reached the gate, the pool was nearly empty. Natalie looked back once more, not out of nostalgia, but affirmation. She hadn't just reclaimed her dignity today, she had expanded the boundaries of what people in that community believed was possible, for themselves, for others, and most importantly, for women who refused to be boxed in by anyone's expectations. As they stepped into the evening, Natalie took Owen's hand. They walked in silence, the streetlights above them casting long shadows that stretched across the sidewalk. But those shadows no longer felt heavy. They felt earned, carried with pride. Because now, everyone knew the truth. She wasn't just a military mom. She was a warrior, a healer, a protector, and a mother. And from this day forward, no one, especially not a woman named Karen, would ever make her feel less than that again.